Welcome, Ian Watson, celebrated writer.
Hello, delighted to see you. And take off my hat to you, and we could be brothers.
Well, you grew up in the 1950s, didn't you? And it was a, post-war world, a changing world. So what got you interested in science fiction?
Well, it was not the world that I was living in. I was living on Tyneside,
Hmm.
a very depressive place. You'd be walking by the sea, and people would spontaneously say to you, "Way, it's treacherous today down there." It was not. It was a perfectly normal day. And if you said something that was even slightly unusual, they would say to you, "Man, you'll bring about the downfall of nations." Half of the inhabitants would leave and go to the south of England. Of those, half would never return, and the other half would come back 3 weeks later saying, "Well, way, it's treacherous down there." I looked up at the stars and hallucinated a more ample world. But my local library in North Shields, which was mainly, which was a trade port on the River Tyne, for some reason, wonderfully, had all the newly published Golden Age science fiction
Hmm.
in American editions. This can only have been that there was a secret librarian fanatic who was spending money on. The majority of the people in the library were old chaps with flat caps sleeping on copies of the shipping news. But there it was, all for me, and I was able to take it home and read it.
Well, you studied English, didn't you? And you taught English around the world.
Yes, well, I studied English at Oxford because, I could speak it already. This is all stuck in my brain. And I could not care less about Norse sagas. Now, this means that actually I am one of the few people who went to Oxford who has never read Lord of the Rings and has no desire ever to. And I did go to a few lectures by Tolkien's son, but that was about Milton and Paradise Lost, and that's sort of pretty acceptable. But English literature ended at 1914. There was none after that. One of the persons who actually influenced me as a writer before I got to Oxford was Graham Greene,
Hmm.
for because of the tripart nature of his novel outlines. My first 3 novels followed the same tripartite structure. And then there was the exoticism of being in other countries
Hmm.
rather than England most of the time. And then there was all the mystery of Catholicism, which dogged his characters, giving them neuroses and identity, which did not connect with me in the slightest, but which was quite fascinating.
Hmm.
Oh yeah, and then I taught it. Well, mainly, I have never worked. Now, we have to explain that. I've been extremely lucky. So, because I got a first at Oxford, I was able to do a research degree into French literature for
Hmm.
2 years, which was getting closer to what I wanted. When I finished that, well, the disreputable younger sons used to be sent to the colonies, and the Oxford academic equivalent was sending you to teach in foreign universities. So I got shuffled off to the University of East Africa, which did have an influence upon me, but it was a cultural desert and boring as hell. Even the West Africans were the bee's knees
Hmm.
in imagination and novels and poetry and art. This was back in the 1960s. and the Tanzanians were actually resentful at the West African cultural imperialism. It wasn't the Western cultural imperialism, it was the West African cultural imperialism. It was really deeply boring.
Hmm.
I mean, I did have when I had enough money for petrol, I'd drive off to a game reserve and crash into a boulder, and uh, I can tell some anecdotes of that sort of thing.
Well, a bit of my history. So, my reading history. So, started off as a teenager reading sort of fantasy stuff, and I sort of outgrew that really quickly. I started to read a lot of science fiction, and then I came across your book, the Embedding.
Mhm.
I realized that all the science fiction I was reading before wasn't science fiction. It was just adventure books. It could have been set any time. It was just guys fist fighting, laser guns, that sort of thing.
Oh,
Yeah, and I realized that yours was the first proper science fiction because it had science in it, and not just the fiction part.
oh, good, good.
So how did you? It's a really interesting idea. It was all about how language can change people, basically, wasn't it? It was. How did you get that idea?
Well, I was actually in Birmingham History of Art School in the ideal place
Hmm.
to rub brains up against a semiologist, a student who was teaching the meaning of meaning. And the other people there was a Hungarian art historian. They all kind of meshed, and there was a younger um, art historian who was a bit disrespectable um, because he could never get out of bed, though he lived close by, and with whom I took LSD. Discovered the nature of my perceptions, which links up with how you encode data and how
Hmm.
you think. I was with the ideal bunch of people. There was oh yeah, and also a social anthropologist woman. I was with the perfect bunch of people. So when we went for a drink, I was stimulated and excited. So I was reading a lot. Because I read much more in those days. I've become much
Hmm.
slower now. And so I was reading about Chomsky and Wittgenstein and
Hmm.
discovering things that I had not known earlier. Well, I only discovered them, of course, to a certain extent, because I'm sure that there are all sorts of errors and blah, blah, blah. But because I don't have a science background, uh, I did once want to be a chemist, but then during the O-level practical experiment, we were performing a titration, which involved sucking up liquid up tubes, and I swallowed far too much methylated spirit. Uh,
How did the publishing deal with Gollancz come about?
Oh, well, I didn't know what you did with the book then when you'd
Hmm.
finished it. So I had three copies because I had two sheets of carbon paper.
Hmm.
Uh, and I sent the book to three publishers, um, one of whom ignored it totally, one rejected it curtly, and the other, which was Gollancz, uh, showed interest and said I would really need to rewrite it. Would I like to come for a lunch? And I
Hmm.
thought, there you know, I'll do that. That's how the publishing deal came about.
Hmm.
One funny aspect of this is that it was a private company, a private uh, publisher then, owned by a family, Golan's family. And after my fourth book, the boss, that was John Bush, Captain Bush, he said to me, "My boy, it's an annuity for life, this writing business. They'll just go on republishing." And he was completely bloody wrong. It was all a bit of a fight through the 1980s. And then I was rescued by number one, Games Workshop, and number two, Kubrick,
What do you think the function of science fiction should be?
to change people's consciousness. change their perception of reality, make them notice what is here. Most people walk blind through the streets, and I see things which are there, but which are just invisible to other people.
Right.
So it's opening the doors of perception.
On to Kubrick then. So how did there was yourself and Kubrick, and you had a Brian Aldiss story to work from, didn't you, for the what eventually became the film AI, Artificial Intelligence. How did all that come together? How did all that start with Kubrick?
Oh, well, I mean, Kubrick first bought the Anecdote by Aldous, Super Toys, about 1980, early 1980s. Kubrick would work for years on a theme until he achieved perfection, or thought so. But he had to work with somebody. Now, he got rid of Aldous because Aldous hated Stanley's obsession with Pinocchio and making the film a robot version of Pinocchio. He worked with Bob Shaw twice, and he, after a bit, he ran out of science fiction writers because who were close enough to come and visit him for hours. So he sent off his assistant, this is the story, to visit science fiction bookshops which existed then, and say, Squire, who is a science fiction writer in England with lots of ideas? And because of the way the blurbs they wrote on the back of my books, they would tend to say, Ian Watson, try Ian Watson. And so came the phone call, the summons to Kubrick Castle. I was mildly suspicious of this, but so I insisted on driving my own car there. But anyway, I got on very well with Stanley, and continued working with him about 3 times a week. I would go there, he would make lunch, or it would be a Chinese takeaway or something else. And then we would brainstorm in the snooker room, which was not used for snooker. Then I would, in the morning, write up what we had discussed the afternoon before. I would fax it to him before noon, and then after it wouldn't be very long, and then he would either say, we'd better have another session this afternoon, Ian, or he'd say, carry on, God bless you, or it's like you're writing a B movie for morons. There were varying responses, but I regarded it as mainly a lot of fun. There's a story, I think, by an SF writer called Jerome Bixby called It's a Good Life. It's about a child with paranormal potent powers who can cause anything to happen that he wants. And his, I felt it was a bit like that with Stanley. And I was in his playground. Stanley asked me to write a 12,000 word story. And he gave me Pinocchio the book, and he gave me the Aldous short story, and he said, do whatever you want. So I did whatever I wanted. And after a month, I sent it. And came a phone call from Tony Fruin, the assistant, saying, Stanley wants to see you. Lunch tomorrow. You'll be collected. I went down there, and Stanley said, oh, okay, Ian, now what you wrote is no use for the film at all, but I like the way you wrote it. So will you work for me? I'll ask Warner Brothers. I'll tell Warner Brothers to get in touch with you and with a proposal.
Mm.
The next day, Warner phoned me and said, Stanley said that we have to hire you, but we don't know how to rate you, whether you are high, medium, or low. And I said, well, 5'6". And they said, no, we mean the kind of money. And I said, oh, I'll have to think about that. So I phoned Bob Shaw and asked him how much he was paid, and discovered that his yes, he's dead, Bob. That's a shame. That his agent and wife, X, had accepted £600 per week, no, $600 a week, which was the first offer of Warner Brothers. So I said, thanks, Bob. So when Warner phoned me back again and said, have you thought? And I said, yeah, well, for example, if I wrote a story for Stanley, I would not be able to publish it because it would belong to him.
Mm.
If I published it, for example, in Playboy or Omni, I'd be talking about, several $1,000s. And now this has not happened to me very often. But and I said that plus there'd be the repeats and residuals, like translations and blah blah blah. And they said, okay, we'll tell Stanley this. And they phoned back 10 minutes later and said, will you accept $3,000 a week? And I said, yes. Now, this was 6 times what Bob Shaw's agent had said yes to.
Mm.
Because she, never mind, we'll not talk about that. Anyway, this is how things went on.
Hmm. So, were you quite upset because it was sort of shelved, wasn't it, for a while? And Kubrick never actually filmed it. Were you quite saddened by that?
Well, I was interested by that. Now, you know that most things don't get filmed. Now, Stanley had at least 10 unfulfilled projects in his Napoleon film, for which he had hired the Romanian army, and he made 19th century uniforms for them. So the fact that he was approaching making a film did not mean it was going to happen. Oh no. Where I ceased to know what was going on particularly was when he had to go working with Sarah Maitland. And due to me, he'd taken on board as the house artist Fangorn, Chris Baker.
Yeah.
So I would see Chris at conventions and I'd say, how are things? And Chris would say, I'm not allowed to talk to you. And I say, well, I'm allowed to talk to you because I never signed any agreements. And this continued until Stanley died. If Stanley died through overworking on post-production of Eyes Wide Shut.
Yeah.
The philosophy of Warner Brothers was Warner Brothers England was that, as they told me, we'd like to get another movie out of Stanley before he kicks off his clogs. It's not urgent. We'll go on funding him for a long time.
Yeah.
Because he is not an immediate high earner, but the long term, with all the residuals and foreign cinemas, make him an extremely strong investment.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he died. Well, it was fortunate in one way because he died in his sleep, and Stanley was very scared of dying. So he would never have known that he died.
Yeah.
And it's a pity he wasted so much time worrying about dying and protecting himself against dying. So then after a short while, Spielberg, whom he had asked once or twice if if Spielberg would direct the movie, because it was more Spielberg's emotional register. Well, Spielberg made it as a homage to the movie. And fortunately, Spielberg or his team, I don't know how in such a hurry, read through all the library of Babel that I had faxed to Stanley and put back into the story significant things that Stanley had ordered me to leave out, such as the Flesh Fair, the festival of carnival of destruction of the robots. And thank God they were put back in again by Spielberg. And ultimately, I got screen credit because basically the what appears on screen is what I wrote to a pleasing and strange degree.
When's your birthday? I never had a birthday.
His name is David.
I feel it. That's creepy. Whoa, feels so real.
In a distant future, in an age of intelligent machines, he is the first robotic child programmed to love and coexist as a member of a family. His is a tale of humanity and a journey to find his place among humans and machines.
I'm a boy.
You are a real boy. At least as real as I've ever made one.
Well, there also is some ins and outs about this, and mainly you should not believe anything that anybody says about Kubrick, including me. I know this because an Italian specialist on Kubrick called Filippo Olivieri interviewed me here in Spain twice for several days. It was more like psychoanalysis. And he was able to demonstrate to me that everything published so far about Kubrick is filled with untruths because of egos of the authors or special pleading. And also what I wrote is probably, even though this is what I remember exactly, it's probably false news, which is a bit disturbing. The thing is that Filippo had read everything by me. He photographed every page of the material that I had faxed in a box, and then he read it all and indexed it all. So yeah, he has made some interesting short movies, videos about which are all worth watching intensely. Worth it.
Well, you worked on the Warhammer 40K books. So how did all that come about as well with Games Workshop?
Well, back in about 1989, the outright owner of Games Workshop, who was called Brian Ansell, wished to read, quote, real novels by real authors set in his beloved domains of Warhammer and 40K. And so he got in touch with David Pringle, editor of Interzone, Britain's prime magazine at the time. And Pringle said, well, I'll get all my real writers to write Warhammer stories, and they'll be very attracted. And then Ansel said, yes, we'll pay them £10,000 in guaranteed royalties. That is to say, you'd get more if you sold more than 10,000, but you get 10,000 straight away. And all the writers shouted, yes, yes, me. And I didn't foolishly, or no, not foolishly, I suppose. I don't like war very much. And I didn't feel like, I was not a gamer, and I wasn't feeling very much enchanted by spreading the message of war throughout the universe. However, about a year later, I became in need of 10,000 in guaranteed royalties. So I said, okay, I surrender. And Pringle said to me, well, now, Ian, the other writers have all grabbed Warhammer, generic medieval fantasy, because they just need to write generic fantasy and put in Warhammer names. Also somebody had grabbed Dark Future, which no longer exists. So now, Pringle tested me, write a story and on this subject, and I was, he was, I was too flippant, showing that I wasn't taking it seriously enough. And so I darkened it a lot. And then the owner, Brian Ansell, chipped in with helpful emails describing how he liked to read the descriptions of weapons, the shining, the glisten, the clicks and everything. Very lyrical about use of weapons. And I realized this was important too. So I wrote my novel Inquisitor, and it was published by Games Workshop Books Brighton. And then there was a rupture between, then Brian Ansell, they got rid of him in a corporate management takeover.
Okay.
Yeah, and other persons came in who were not Brian Ansell. And the other persons said, what we want from you writers is a collective novel about the career of a space marine, with all of you writing a section. And they invited us to Nottingham to canopies and wine to discuss this. And everyone agreed. And I said, I'll write the starter chapter, setting everything up. And lo, I did this. And none of the other buggers wrote a word. This is far too much material to master. You can't just write generic space opera and put in Warhammer words. No. So I carried on and wrote the whole book, Space Marine. And my problem was, you have these Citadel miniatures. How on earth do you endow them with personality and even names? And what I did was to have a kind of homoerotic subtext for my amusement, with these great hulking persons in battle monasteries. And so I finished the book with, quite happily to my satisfaction. And Nottingham said, Ian, you must change large amounts of this book. There are some things which must never appear about our Space Marines. And I said, okay. Now, suddenly, there was a rupture between Nottingham and Pringle. And for 9 months, nothing happened until GW signed an agreement with Box Tree, book packagers and distributors, to publish for them. So they published My Space Marine exactly as I wrote it, because no one told them that it was supposed to be edited, changed, and everything else. Now Games Workshop were not totally happy about this. And in fact, they kept it out of print for about 10 years. But I adopted a humorous sort of Chinese water torture, drip, drip, of ironies, until they finally broke and allowed it to be printed as an expensive print-on-demand book, not to be sold in shops to schoolboys. You know, between the beginning of my Warhammer career and the end, the audience had changed from goths aged about 20 years old with rings through their noses to 12-year-old schoolboys. And Games Workshop follows where the money is, because the money is almost 90% is in Warhammer 40k, and of that Warhammer 40k, 90% was in Space Marine.
Yeah.
They've now introduced a new hierarchy of warriors twice the size, which I can't comment about because I'm not following the games. It seems like a completely mercenary notion to me, and ruins the the grandeur and grottiness of Space Marines. So anyway, I end up with 4 books in print, and occasionally they're in an omnibus. I do get royalties for these, but I don't own the moral rights because I waived those. That meant that when they were reprinting one of my stories about a squat, that's a race, called Grimm, who was a comic foil, the Tyranids had destroyed all the squats in the interim, so they changed Grimm to a completely boring tech priest, unquote, called Grill, unquote. However, even they realized that this was a bad idea, and in the next edition changed it back again to Grimm. I would prefer them to pay me lots more money and reprint my books, but they're regarded as archive legacies now, because they're so out of sync with what has happened in the games.